Hello, this is Dr. Daniel Van Ingen with this week's Parenting Podcast, and today we are continuing our Parenting Doctors interview series, and I've got an excellent treat for all of you. I've got the clinical psychologist, Dr. Patricia Price, back. She is back. Many of you have been asking for her to come back, and we're so excited to have her back today. She is going to talk about teaching our children good body image. So I've got some good questions for her. She's going to speak from a depth of experience. And for those of you, we have a great iTunes interview with her where we talk about eating disorders. So check that out. And also check out Dr. Price's children's book, No More Screen Time. She is the author of a children's picture book, No More Screen Time. Dr. Price has long been concerned about the overuse of screens, particularly amongst youth, and she's become a huge proponent of providing old-fashioned experiences to children. And Dr. Price, she specializes in eating disorders, anxiety and depression in children, teens, and young adults. She does a great job. She's a wonderful colleague, and she comes from the University of St. Thomas, and I'm proud to call her a friend and a colleague. And I'm so excited that you are here, Dr. Price. Again, welcome back.
Thank you, Dan.
So let's jump right into it. And you can find out more information at parentingdoctors.com, where she is a featured contributor as part of Team Parenting Doctors. And she knows a lot about this stuff. So let's jump right into teaching our children good body image. So, Dr. Price, what are some of the keys to teaching our children good body image?
I think as much as possible, one of the most important keys is for parents to not talk about their own body image, especially if it's negative, in front of their children from the get-go. There's a lot of parents on different diets these days. One of the initial keys is to just not have any conversations of those types. What foods are good or bad? What makes you fat? The word. The F word, fat, keeping that to a minimum, and also not talking about other people's bodies. If you see someone in a store who, doesn't fit the ideal, not making a snide comment in front of your kids. All those things are really important initial things that you can do as a parent.
So I think an important thing, Dr. Price, is self-acceptance and self-love. But we are against a culture that really teaches different things. What do you think of the societal messages when it comes to body image?
Boy, I wish I felt like things were getting better in terms of like the environment being a breeding ground for eating disorder development. But I feel like over the course of the last 30 years, things have actually gotten worse. Back in the late 80s, early 90s, the main thing was fat-free. Everything was fat-free, that was the main focus. There was Weight Watchers, but today we have this just booming economy of diet trends. And, every time you turn around, there's another idea of what's going to make you better, stronger, faster, leaner, and boy, the messages are just amplified. I feel like, and the other thing that I've noticed a change in that the eating disorder community is really very much aware of on the increase is male eating disorders. Male eating disorders used to be relatively rare. They were probably thought to be more rare than they actually were. But today, there's a huge awareness of, the demands that are on males to have chiseled abdomens, and it's interesting because if you look at the we've always heard about how Barbie dolls affected girls' body image,
Yeah.
but if you look at the changes between action figures of the 1970s and 1980s and those exact same action figures today, you look at the Batman from the 70s and 80s versus the Batman of today, the Thor of the 80s versus the Thor of today. It's fascinating to look, if you find pictures of those, the extreme body differences between how they used to look and how they look today. And there's just a lot of subtle messages for both boys and girls about what the ideal is. And it sometimes goes under our radar. Like, unless you point it out to parents, they don't even notice.
Yeah, so it almost like sort of taps into that schema of, I'm not good enough. I'm only good enough if I'm chiseled. I'm only good enough if I'm, and so so it really works against the self-love, self-acceptance, and that I am enough, and that I am good enough inherently because I'm a lovable child. And the society really pushes these if-then rules. If you have, right, if you're chiseled, then you're good enough, or if you're ripped, then you're good enough for boys, and for girls, what are the if-thens for girls?
It can be very similar to the boys. I mean, the girl athlete, it's difficult sometimes because the more athletic a body is, the higher the BMI is. And so what we're seeing a lot of these days is very, very muscular teenagers who aren't underweight in terms of the old-fashioned standards of being underweight, but they are full-blown anorexia patients because for their body size and the amount of muscle mass that's on their bodies, they're super underweight.
Okay.
So they don't appear to look like anorexia patients that we think of when we think of the waif-thin, almost fainting, passing out, low-weight patient. They look somewhat athletic. They have chiseled, you can see their muscles. You can see they have muscle on them. However, for where they're supposed to be developmentally, they're maybe 25 pounds underweight. And it really, those are the patients that I find it most difficult to work with, because they are being told by their teammates and their coaches and their parents that they look great, and yet they're not having their period. Maybe in boys, puberty hasn't begun, and they're too low weight. And that's now understood as there's a new diagnosis called atypical anorexia. And if you Google atypical anorexia, you'll see that's a relatively new concept. And I see both boys and girls suffering what they consider, when boys and girls are too concerned about their muscle tone and being, having perfect muscle tone. They consider that to be called muscle dysmorphic disorder. And it's just an obsession with muscle tone and movement, and it's really on the uptick right now.
Yeah, that's really interesting. What about the course of natural body cues, Dr. Price? Like our body goes through cycles, right? We go through ups and downs. It could be water weight. It could be just a lot of the developmental changes as children go through puberty. What are some things that we need to do to not ignore the natural body cues?
Well, I always describe to patients that, when little kids are born, when an infant is born, most people are born with a perfect, we're like Ferraris when we're born. Everything is in perfect working condition. Brand new Ferrari, with a perfectly working gas gauge, right?
Yeah.
I talk about this with kids all the time, that when you were an infant, you cried when you were hungry, and you stopped eating when you were full. And you knew, your parents knew how to feed you, and no one questions, is this baby too fat or too thin or whatever. And that kind of progresses for several years into toddlerhood and the early elementary years. Most kids, if you look at kids that haven't had any interventions, nobody said anything negative to them about their weight. You see them going to the cupboard to get snacks when they're hungry, and you see them not eat when they're not hungry. And I'm always trying to encourage parents to just allow that to be the case and to not go too far in intervening. I see some parents very early on saying, nope, you cannot eat between meals. So kids have their natural hunger cues, and they're being told by society to ignore them, or that they're incorrect, or that they can't trust their own hunger cues because they're wrong. And that's very rarely the case. What I try to encourage parents to do as much as possible is let their kids kind of dictate what they want at different times. I mean, of course, it has to be respectful to, if you're eating something for dinner, you can't just let the kid have whatever they want. But in terms of timing, if a kid just had lunch 2 hours ago and they happen to want a snack right now, it's probably because their body needs a snack. So as much as possible, helping kids respect their own body cues and respecting your kid's body cues. And so, with eating disorders, somewhere along the line, the gas gauge gets broken.
Okay.
And no longer, the kid's brain and body no longer trust each other. Maybe somewhere along the line, a comment was made that a kid is getting toward the obese range. I see that happen a lot with pediatricians who are seeing pre-adolescent kids, and there is a tendency. There's a tendency to, in development, to kind of go through phases where you get a little chunkier or larger, and then you grow tall.
Yeah, what do you do, Dr. Price, if your pediatrician starts to mention that your child is overweight?
That's a great question. I can actually tell you I had that happen to one of my children about 2 years ago, and this doctor knows that I work with eating disorder patients, and I immediately stopped him because he was saying that right in front of my son. And it's unfortunate that pediatricians and other medical doctors are often very focused on the obesity epidemic, and they're not very well trained in underweight or other types of eating disorders. And so, I'm of the opinion that unless your child has a chronic weight issue that you know your child best. I mean, you know the ebbs and flows of your kids. This son of mine happens to always kind of get bigger before he grows tall, and it's been a pattern since he was an infant. So I recommend talking to your physician without the kid present and just really, really asking them if it's a big concern or, if it can not be made to be a big concern, because oftentimes it's just a stage of development. If your kid is eating healthy and they're eating normally and healthy, they're not going to have a weight problem. If your kid is eating 3 bags of chips every night, well, then that might be a different story. Or if your kid is getting up in the middle of the night and having ice cream at 3 in the morning. I mean, your kid best, and just don't assume that your pediatrician understands eating disorders. That would be my recommendation.
So if, Dr. Price, if we do have a real issue of obesity when you look at the last 50 years, and when I was growing up, it was all about, go out and play. And when the lights went on, then you had to go home. And even during summer days, you could just be out in a safe neighborhood, right? And so nowadays, I just sat with an 11-year-old the other day. And so what do you do? What do you play? Fortnite, Grand Theft Auto. And I was thinking basketball, baseball. No. Do you ever go outside and play? Nope. And I sat with a 16-year-old today, and he actually said the same video games. It's Fortnite and Grand Theft Auto. And we can get into the video game issue another day, but you have a lot of sitting, right? You have a lot of data that points to increased obesity. So how do you balance, if you are concerned about your child who might be very overweight? So there's overweight, very overweight. Maybe you can explain the different categories. How do you balance the self-acceptance and self-love and the developmental process, and balance that with we have a whole lot more knowledge on ingredients. We have a whole lot more knowledge on how sugar is the enemy, right? And
right.
And how do you balance and the importance of not sitting but going out and making friends, playing kickball, and hunting for frogs down here, not hunting for alligators, which some boys like to do. How do you balance all that out?
Oh, that's a great, huge question. I think that is it's a much broader problem in those kind of cases than just anything related to weight. Kids have got to get out and get exercise, and that's kind of the point of when I was talking about going to your pediatrician. If you know your kid is sedentary and really doing no physical activity all day and has an obesity problem, that's a huge conversation to be had with your pediatrician, and it probably involves more parent education than direct intervention with the kid. And I think, that spells out kind of the difference between a pediatrician mentioning weight with a kid like that versus if you bring your child in who plays 3 sports and happens to be in a heavier phase of his childhood, and the doctor starts talking about obesity. That's a real issue. But boy, it goes back to my whole fear about screen time and my worry about families that just allow their children to do that. I'm just worried about those particular video games in particular. I know that's for another podcast, but I think in terms of teaching body image, it has to be focused on health.
Yeah.
If you know that obesity in your child is probably gonna cause life-threatening health problems, you can't just ignore that. And you have to learn. I think it's about parent education on diet, on their own diet processes too.
Yeah.
Um,
and I know.
And unfortunately, that kind of runs in families. I think. Obesity is highly genetic, and so it's probably a full family education at that point.
Yeah. And so, how do you know if you're a parent that the obesity or the overweight is an issue? Like, I think that parents want to know, if my kid is overweight, is this something I need to be concerned about? Or is this a process of development that has to do with size and height and patience, and ultimately we want to encourage self-love and self-acceptance?
Right. I think that goes back to what the definition of an eating disorder is. I mean, someone who is obese probably has some form of eating disorder, unless it's super highly genetic. And there are certain people who are genetically larger, and who fall into an obese category. I think it all has to do with behavior. If you are eating healthy and you're eating a well-balanced diet and your body still trends upward, that's a whole lot different than if you see, and if your child is eating healthy and their body size is just larger, that's a whole lot different than if you see your child buying a fun-sized bag of Snickers and eating it in one sitting, and having a weight issue because of that. So I think you have to look at the behavior more than the weight itself, to determine whether there's an issue. I have my son is 13 and he has friends at all different stages of adolescence. Some who have gone through the growth spurt, some who are just ready to go through their growth spurt. And I would say you have to look at the eating habits themselves to determine, and the amount of control the kid has. Binge eating disorder is not just binge eating disorder because there's large amounts of food eaten. Like a true binge is a loss of control. So if a kid is losing control over their eating, or mindlessly eating to the point that that they don't seem to be able to control it, that's a whole different issue than if a kid is just eating healthy.
Yeah. Dr. Price, how do you help a child to be secure with themselves, confident, and really work against the societal messages that we need to compare? How do you help a child not compare? Because it seems like a lot of what's behind the muscle dysmorphic disorder that you were mentioned earlier is really about, how do I look compared to? And
yeah. It's hard. I mean, I think that as a parent, you have to be constantly educating kids about what's normal, what the difference is between dedication and obsession. I think that's a big one. Yeah. I'm constantly pointing out to my kids. Just recently there was a newspaper article in our local paper about a guy who had run. Who was he had a streak of running every single day of his life for the last 50 years. And the paper highlighted it as, wow, what an achievement, how dedicated. But halfway through the article, it talked about how he had even achieved maintaining the streak despite having a broken ankle at one point. He ran through the broken ankle. And then it also talked about a week that he had spent in a hospital where he was quarantined to his hospital room. So In order to keep the streak running, he decided to run around his bed in the hospital. And here our local paper is applauding that message, right?
Yeah.
Applauding and saying, wow, how dedicated. And, I wrote a letter to the editor saying, gosh, we got to teach our kids better. This is not, you have to, there's a difference between dedication and obsessive compulsive behavior. Yeah. And, education. And if that means parents need to learn, I encourage them to try to understand themselves that there is a big difference between being healthy and, dedicated to a sport and going too far. It's not healthy to run through an injury. It's not, there was a kid growing up when I was a kid that died from a Tylenol overdose from taking too much Tylenol before a race because she was in so much pain. We have to stay on top of what's healthy and what crosses the line.
Yeah. As a parenting doctor, you and I, we know that our environment and how we communicate, the messages that we give to the children really have a huge impact on how they internalize the messages about themselves. So if we not only say, but also convey in our attachment and affection and unconditional love and regard and support, if we convey the messages, you are enough, you are loved, you are lovable, you are acceptable to me fully and completely, they themselves then learn, then their self-talk, they internalize those messages that I am enough, I am loved, I am lovable, I am acceptable, and I accept myself. But we also know that we can love unconditionally and we can do everything we can as parents with what I just said. There's also a societal influence, right? And
for sure.
And so how do we deal with that societal influence and when it comes to the self-talk of the child?
That's so true. I also have I always speak about my own kids as examples, but I have a 9-year-old daughter who, is right there with picking up on, what's good looking and what's not good looking, what hairstyles are attractive. Gosh, constantly I think have to go back to reminding them that those things are not who they are, and there's so much more. And it comes back to you can't totally, if a kid develops an eating disorder, the parent cannot be faulted because boy, there's so much that goes into an eating disorder development, largely genetics.
Yeah.
However, you can do your best.
Yeah.
To just constantly be aware of those messages, and if you hear your child commenting on somebody else's body, boy, that's a great point of entry to have a good discussion about what the kid really values and what values should be important and what what things you should notice about a person and what you'd want someone to notice about you.
Yeah, and I feel like we're soldiers, we're generals in a war. And I feel like we have to confront these societal messages because we can really work really hard, do everything we can in terms of prayer and parenting to send the message, convey the message, to help the children internalize the messages that they are enough, that they are loved, that they are accepted, they are acceptable, and that they in turn internalize the messages, I'm enough, I'm lovable, I'm acceptable as I am. But society is sending the messages, and this is why I think we have to confront these societal messages explicitly with our children, because society is sending the messages they are not enough unless they are not loved, unless they are not accepted, unless they're ripped, they're chiseled, they have this nice butt that they and so,
Absolutely.
and so the body image is never enough. And
absolutely. And we were talking a little bit before this started with in terms of sports, and sports are so amped up on that too. Like, my kids' teammates might all be in some kind of elite endurance training program, right?
Yep.
And the teammates that choose not to do that are like considered a little bit less, and as parents, it comes into play as parents too. Like, you find yourself as a parent saying, "Geez, he's doing that. Maybe Michael should do that, or maybe maybe that's something we should get into." And it gets to be just a rat race of competition for who's doing the most to excel their game. And
this brings me to my favorite book, Dr. Price, by John Tower, a social psychologist at the University of St. Thomas, Why Less is More for WASPs, well-intentioned but over-involved sports parents. And Dr. Tower talks about, ultimately the goal is fun, and that we need to release and let go.
Absolutely, yeah. But then you get into, some parents from third grade on are pretty focused on getting their kids into the NBA or the NFL, and it gets really stressful. And I think as parents, you just have to step back and put up a boundary and go, all right, I'm not going to enter this rat race, because if you can say no, your kid can learn to say no.
Yeah, and for those parents who are in the rat race, I think one of the take-home messages, in terms of the muscle dysmorphic disorder point, when it comes to competition or when it comes to pursuing excellence, I mean, actually, you've given us so many great messages here, Dr. Price, and thank you so much. But one of them is dedication, not obsession. Another one is it's about what you can do, not what you look like.
Right.
And it's if you can do 5 pull-ups, great. But staring in the mirror and taking pictures and sending them to your friends and arguing who has more chisel, well, that would be very unhealthy.
Right. Or even bragging about how many sports camps you did today. We're in that tier of competitive families that the kids sit there and say, "Oh, I only had 2 sports camps today. Well, I had 3." As much as you can get your kids to not talk about that stuff with each other and just focus on better topics.
And living a balance.
Just finding some balance, because kids get really anxious when they feel like they're not able to keep up with other kids, and it gets to be extreme. And I see parents stressed out that they're not keeping up with what other parents are doing. And so, the more we can top down teach them that stuff is not important, and that comparison is not important, the happier they'll be, and the more able to turn that off they'll be.
Yeah. And Dr. Price, you have, what I understand the word is amongst colleagues, that you potentially have a video series that may be coming out for on disordered eating. Did I get that word through the grapevine correctly?
That's right. That's my goal.
So that's going to be a great contribution to the
I'm
field.
I'm going to try to do a video series starting probably next week. And I have different topics related to various eating disorders and parenting.
Well, you are such a great positive contributor to our parenting doctor's work. Let me give you the last word here as we finish up on any final thoughts on the critical importance of teaching our children good body image.
As much as you can avoid discussing their body with them and focusing on your own body around them. I think, if you had one take-home message, not discussing body and diet around your kids, I think is the key, or it is a huge key. And I think in our culture, there's so many dieting messages that just crushes me because I thought those would decline over time, and they've only increased. And so when you see that, trying to combat, every food is healthy in moderation.
Yeah. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you just heard an interview with Dr. Patricia Price, an expert in Minnesota. And check out her book, No More Screen Time, and I will provide more information further on her upcoming video series. An expert on eating disorders. We thank you so much for your being here, Dr. Price. Wish you the best, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.